Hello my lovely, Sarah Jane Critchley here, the author of A Different Joy, The Parent's Guide to Living Better with Autism, Dyslexia, ADHD and more. Today I want to talk to you about a type of autism called pathological demand avoidance. And I want to talk a little bit about what it is, what it might not be, what the issues are around the diagnosis right now. So let's start with a bit of a definition. So pathological demand avoidance is where somebody has an extreme need to avoid any form of routine everyday demand. So if you're talking about a young child, that could be something like someone who just can't even put their socks on, or you're unable to get them ready for school, or if you call them they may always be late for food, they may be impossible to get out of the house, all sorts of things like that. Those are all part of what you might see. So that's a basic definition, but there is a bit of an issue. Last week I was lucky to be part of a meeting from the Participative Autism Research Collective, which is a group of autistic researchers who are talking about PDA and the issues that they might have with PDA, pathological demand avoidance. And a lot of the issues that they were around the fact that the name, pathological, automatically assumes that everyone is broken and that it is a real issue. And that is actually very, very negative. It's a very difficult label to live with. It's a very difficult one. And why would anybody want to actually associate with that as a diagnosis? Now, parents find the diagnosis incredibly helpful because it enables them to find support from people who actually understand what's going on. But for an individual, it's a lot more tricky, and if you really associate with that sort of profile of behaviour, then there's a risk that then makes you feel really negative about yourself, which is obviously a really, really difficult position to be in and far from ideal. So there are lots of issues around that. There are also issues around the fact that it is a condition that is part of the autism spectrum, that it looks, in some ways it's a lot like autism, but it actually demonstrates itself. It comes out in very different ways, and that what works for autism generally won't necessarily, or in fact will definitely not work for young people who have PDA. So that's kind of the concerns that were there, and there are real reservations around the fact that when we start to subdivide different types of autism, we're actually segregating people and undermining the commonality of the experience, when actually these are all different expressions of the same thing. So they have the same underlying issues around flexibility, around special interest, but the way that they are demonstrated, the way they're experienced is very different. And that actually there are people who would be considered classically autistic or of the Asperger profile, those who have very high intellectual capacity, who may well exhibit the sort of behaviours that you would identify as being PDA, but they're still autistic, they're still normally autistic. They wouldn't necessarily get a diagnosis, but they would be behaving in that sort of way because of the extreme reaction that they need in order to avoid being in a really difficult, anxious position. And it's the extremity of that reaction which causes all of the problems. So this was originally, pathological demand avoidance, PDA, was originally coined by Elizabeth Newson, who worked out of, I think it was Sutherland House in Nottingham. And the sort of things that she identified as being issues were around a young person having a very passive early history. So they wouldn't respond, they wouldn't reach for things, they wouldn't point. That they would avoid all demands, and that they might be socially manipulative in doing that. So, for example, if I were asking you to get dressed and you were a child who had a PDA profile, you might say, "Oh, I can't do that," or "I can't, I'd love to do that." "Oh, doesn't your hair look lovely today?" Whereas a typically classically autistic person wouldn't notice or comment. And the sort of responses to a demand would escalate and get progressively more extreme if the demand is not withdrawn and removed. So that's the sort of thing, but there's far more social awareness going on there. There's an issue around having really wide mood swings. So being absolutely fine 1 minute and then very explosive another, or really up and then really down. And there's the huge variability in that. Sorry. The third thing was around being sociable, but there being a sort of obsessive feel to that. So you might find a young person who forms relationships and has a friend at school, but they would have a very, very close obsessive relationship with that friend, and they may want to spend all their time with them and not allow them to play with anybody else. That sort of behaviour is the sort of thing you might be talking about. PDA people will often have a really good understanding of role play. I would enjoy that and may in fact spend lots of time in that in preference to doing other things. Often there's an initial language delay. That was something that Elizabeth Newson noticed, but there'll be catch-up for that. So initially they may not have as many words, but then they would suddenly have a huge catch-up and perhaps come back to what would normally be regarded as a normal amount of language. So what are the kind of issues of these young people and adults actually expressed? And the PDA Society has recently come out with a report called Being Misunderstood. And the report highlighted that there were a number of different issues, and the issues were actually quite profound. And obviously this is a group of people who reported, but there were over 900 responses, so it's a substantial proportion of people. Of those, 96% said that the biggest issues they had were around control. And that's control for the purposes of safety, being safe, being secure and being in control. 81% of those said they had severe anxiety. They identified that as being a huge problem. So this is all control as a response, in a sensible, rational response to huge levels of anxiety. Those gave them huge problems with their daily routines. So it seems in some discussions that we've been having lately around PDA and what happens and how people feel, that there are different types of demands that are really difficult to cope with. And one of those demands are demands that other people put on you, whether they're to be somewhere at a particular time, to wear certain clothing, to hand in homework, all that sort of thing. And the other around internal demands. Oh, I feel I have to, but I can't. So there seems to be a sort of an internal as well as an external element to this. And most worryingly, I think, from my point of view, 70% of those who are identified with a PDA profile said they were not able to attend school regularly. That's a huge proportion in comparison to the autistic population. And it's obviously a real issue for them because it will have a massive impact on their future education. And lots of PDA young people are actually educated at home or are what's known as unschooled, which is where you allow the young person to effectively self-teach and to develop what they want to learn. Interestingly, that's something that for heaven's sake, I can't remember his name now. Elon Musk, sorry. Something that Elon Musk did with his children. He unschooled his children, felt they could learn more by being with him than they could when they were at school. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't know. But for these young people, it's the only place they can feel safe. So what works? If we know that what doesn't work is typical autism approaches of structure, rigidity, predictability, that sort of thing. So what works in PDA? And PDA people have said, and people working with them have said, that what works really well is having more flexibility around the structure. So it may be a case of, well, yes, we can achieve this aim, but maybe not right now, maybe after lunch, maybe you just need to have a bit more flexibility about the way that works. There needs to be a lot more negotiation in order to reduce that level of anxiety down to a level where it can work. Praise works for all people, but it has to be indirect. There's a real demand need to it if you actually praise somebody directly to their face, and that really doesn't work well for PDAs. And a huge thing is around choice. So creating an element of choice, because then you're giving control and that makes it easier to manage. Now, there are some resources that are available. I'll put some links down below for you to click through. I hope you found that helpful. It's just your start of a 10. There is so much. Some places will recognise a PDA diagnosis and will give a diagnosis which will often say someone who is on the autism spectrum but with features of PDA. It's been around since the 1980s. It's been identified throughout. It's not in DSM-5. It's unlikely to be in, which is the main diagnostic criteria. It's unlikely to be in ICD-10 because that tends to mirror DSM-5. So it is unlikely to be accepted as a mainstream diagnosis at this stage. Lots of people who have this sort of profile find that really helpful. And lots of parents who are really struggling with escalating issues around behaviour because these mood swings and behavioural challenges can cause real parenting stress and problems. They often find that other PDA parents and PDA specific support is really helpful. So I'll put in the links below. Click on those. I hope that's helped you, and I hope you have a good week. Lots of love. Take care. Bye.